right hand and repeat after me.
I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear.
About this stunning situation in Florida, where the Secretary of State says only 629 votes, 629 votes separate.
Reasonable certainty. Punch in the mind.
I am furious. They give me a ballot that's illegal. They put it on a machine that doesn't work.
What is at stake is the integrity of our democracy, making sure that the will of the American people.
Many people probably voted for Buchanan, meaning to vote for Gore.
What happens? Do we go to jail? Because I'm willing to go to jail.
No, I just felt that
It was mass confusion. At 7 o'clock when the polls opened, we knew that there was a problem because people were walking out of the polls distraught, calling their husbands, calling their wives, telling them to be careful.
I'm a veteran from 1942, Marine, Purple Heart. I'm entitled to my vote. They're just taking it away from me.
statewide we had complaints of everything from police intimidation, police threatening people with tickets for loitering who happen to be standing in line. We've had reports of people being required to produce multiple pieces of identification when they have a valid voter registration card. There's no such requirement under Florida law.
On election day, I got calls from a lot of people who complained that they had gone to vote and that the local precinct didn't have their name on the list.
They said, I don't have my name there. Why my name is not there? So they sent me to see a clerk.
There were no bilingual pollers. There were no bilingual translators. There was no one there.
You know, the story of the 2000 presidential election is a multifaceted story that has to do with decision-making at a lot of different levels and inconsistencies in policies and in voting systems and technologies.
But the story of the 2000 presidential election started long before Election Day.
Truth be told, Bush did not expect to be campaigning in Florida this hard, this late. After all, Brother Jeb is the popular governor here.
I told my brother that we were going to carry Florida for him. Is that going to be a truthful statement? It better be.
Jeb Bush first ran for governor in 1994. During a debate, he was asked what he would do if elected for Florida's black community. And he gave a two-word answer, which was proved to be both accurate and prophetic. I mean, his answer was probably nothing. That answer galled the black community.
Jeb Bush lost in 1994, but he won in 1998 with only 10% of the black vote.
You've honored me beyond measure by asking me to lead Florida forward into a new...
And he was asked, you know, what he was going to do to reassure black voters. And he said, I guess I'm going to have to reach out to that community. And what he did was reach out and take away almost all the affirmative action programs in the state.
Furious, the state's black leaders started to organize.
We had one of the largest demonstrations ever in Tallahassee, the state capitol, protesting against Governor Jeb Bush's One Florida initiative.
There is increased interest, and it's not going to end with this year.
Blacks decided right then that they were going to mount a voter registration campaign.
All the civil rights organizations from around the country had offices set up here in Florida.
We did tours around the state, going into rural communities, urban communities, community centers, all the way up to corporate buildings.
We had cards that people signed that said they were going to bring 5 people to the polls with them.
So it was an early voter mobilization program.
It's a union, it's a statement, all of us coming together saying that we're not just here. We want to make a difference.
Have we forgotten while my grandmother was hosed down?
Their efforts paid off. 65% more black voters went to the polls than in the previous election.
I'm voting Democrat all the way.
But when Election Day came, there were unexpected obstacles.
As the precincts closed later that evening, we began to get reports here in the Student Government Association from just different students about either not having their voter registration card, going to their precinct that they had voted at before, and now being told that they weren't on the roster, that their names have been purged.
Many more irregularities were confirmed when the NAACP held hearings a few days after the election.
I showed the poll worker my identification, and he looked at the roll, and he looked at me, and he said, "We have a problem. You're not on the roll." I did nothing wrong. I voted in this county. There's no reason why I should not have been on that roll, but I was not on that roll, and I was not allowed to vote.
These irregularities were reported throughout the state.
This effort is to establish a record, a public record, that will further assist the Justice Department, which doesn't seem to be actively trying to establish its own record, with respect to whether or not there have been violations of civil rights and civil rights law, and maybe...
But the most serious voting rights violation was the misuse of something called the Felon Purge List.
There was some type of list of voters that were being purged, so that voters were being removed from the registries by the Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, and by Jeb Bush's office.
The list was based on an old Florida law that prevents ex-offenders from voting.
The law to deny ex-felons the ability to vote was written into the state constitution in 1868 by ex-Confederate soldiers who did it because they were being forced to allow blacks to vote by the federal government. And so they wrote this law in specifically to deny as many blacks as possible their franchise.
This law had only been enforced haphazardly, and then in 1998, to toughen this law, the Republican legislature called for a computerized central list of all ex-offenders in the state. It was Katherine Harris's job to ensure the implementation of this list. But there were problems.
He came on the phone, he said, "Well, Mr. Whiting, have you been to court yet?" I said, "Well, sure. I was a federal juror." And he said, "Oh, no." He said, No. He said, "You couldn't have been a federal juror." I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Because we have you listed as a convicted felon." He said, "You've been purged from our roll."
This man had never been arrested, the minister in the community, but yet they had identified him as a felon.
The bill that was passed by the legislature called for the hiring of a private data crunching firm to identify individuals who should be purged from the voter rolls. Database technology started to create lists of possible matches.
Florida officials told DBT to use loose parameters in setting up the database. Blacks represented more than half the names on this purge list. Since blacks vote over 90% Democratic, the state's instructions eliminated thousands of Democratic voters from the rolls.
And I'll tell you how they did it. They said, don't match middle initial, don't worry about that. Date of birth, don't worry about that. It can be close. Junior, senior, don't worry about that. First name, only use the first 4 letters. If the rest of the letters don't match, don't worry about that.
Let me give you an example. Here's Johnny Jackson Jr. He's matched with a felon in Texas named John Fitzgerald Jackson. You notice that there's no junior. You notice that there's a Fitzgerald. There's no middle name on the Florida voter. Johnny is his legal name, and yet this is John. It's not a complete match.
When you're talking about somebody's right to vote, you don't throw out that wide net, and you don't say, even if the gender doesn't match, you know, even if the race doesn't match, you go ahead and consider that a match.
Go to Leon County, which is Tallahassee, the state capital, where one election supervisor had gone name by name by name to verify.
The list that we received contained 690 felons supposedly registered in Leon County. When we spent an intensive 2-week computer analysis of that data, we were able to confirm 33 of those 690 as felons.
95% of the names that he checked were names of people who had never committed a crime. They just happened to share a name and a rough birthday with someone who had committed a crime.
Marlene Thorogood, the project manager for DBT, had some doubts about these purge lists. One of her emails says, we're going to get a lot of false positives here. That means people on the list who shouldn't be there. And Emmett Mitchell IV, Assistant General Counsel for the Division of Elections, answered her, and this was in late March 1999, said that's the way we want it.
See this guy, Thomas Cooper. Thomas Cooper was born in 1973, and then it says he was convicted of a felony on January 30th, 2007. The clerks wrote notes saying, you know, that there are people convicted in the future here. What should we do? The answer from the Republican functionaries was blank out the conviction dates and no one will know. There are 4,000 blank conviction dates.
Now you have to understand, under Florida law, a supervisor who gets a list from Katherine Harris has to remove the name. They have no choice unless they have specific evidence that there's an error on that name.
How do the supervisors figure that out? What tools do we have at our disposal other than sending someone a letter?
Letters saying, you're listed as a felon. If that's not true, send us documentations and papers and we'll check it out.
People were considered guilty and had to prove themselves innocent to the state before they could be allowed to vote.
I mean, in our county, for example, we had about 300 names that we never even sent those folks letters because they were not matches at all, according to us. We didn't even bother going down that road. The names were vastly different.
We're finding out, we're going county to county, finding out that at least 15% of the people removed from the voter rolls were innocent of any crime. That's 8,000 voters. Half of them are black. 93% of all black voters in Florida voted Al Gore. Well, you do the arithmetic, and there's the presidency. Katherine Harris, who's in charge of the entire voter purge project, she's also the co-chair of the George W. Bush for President campaign in Florida.
Clayton Roberts, the director of the Division of Elections under Katherine Harris, was asked why this list was so inaccurate and who was responsible.
They do what we contract them to do. We have a statute that says we have to have a private company to do this. We put it out for bid. They got the bid. And I think I'm done with this interview.
Wait, well, let me just show you the contract, if I could, Mr. Roberts. Wait, it says here, right in the contract, that the verification is supposed to be done by DBT, that you paid them $4 million.
The state of Florida would not spend $100,000 in voter education, but the state of Florida spent $4 million identifying felons.
Then, county election supervisors found another flaw. Ex-offenders from other states who had their voting rights restored were also purged.
My rights were taken from me. My rights were stripped. Unlike other people, when I came from New York City, I had right to vote. But when I went to vote one day and applied to vote, I was told that I couldn't vote. And I said, what do you mean I can't vote? And he said, well, because you're a felon. I said, I know I'm a felon. I don't have anything to hide from you. Well, felons in this state can't vote. I said, what do you mean felons in this state can't vote?
They mentioned that they wrote a note to Katherine Harris's office saying, well, we're not supposed to purge these people, are we? And they got back a note from Jeb Bush's office saying, if there's someone from another state who comes into Florida with their civil rights but may have had a record, they have to ask Jeb Bush for permission to vote.
That position has been rejected by the state Supreme Court, by a federal court. It was clearly illegal for them to insist that people have to go through the clemency process if they came from another state in which their rights were automatically restored.
Over 2,800 ex-felons who had moved to Florida and whose voting rights had been restored were illegally purged from the voter rolls.
93% of the people who come out of prison vote Democratic. So they knew exactly who they were removing from the voter rolls. There was no guesswork. here.
You had a Republican governor whose brother was running as a Republican for President of the United States, deciding how many of these potential Democratic votes were going to be cast.
In January 2001, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights held hearings in Florida on voting irregularities. The commission heard testimony from George Bruder, project manager for DBT.
There's no doubt the list included a number of what we call false positives, as the Division of Election required the exceptions list to be very broad. We advised the state of the likelihood of a significant number of false positives and made recommendations to reduce those numbers. However, and I quote, "We wanted these lists to be fairly broad and encompassing," said Emmett Bucky Mitchell, a former Division of Elections lawyer who headed the purge effort.
It's databases, a Secretary of State who is a chairman of a political campaign working with the brother of the presidential candidate. We thought that the issue of race and voting was settled in 1965 after the assassination of Martin Luther King, Voting Rights Act of 65.
Now we're back to the basic issue. Do black people have the right to vote? Except this time it's not George Wallace standing in the doorway of a schoolhouse saying segregation now and forever. Now it's done quietly and with computers.
I don't think anybody who went to bed last night could imagine waking up this morning and not knowing who the President of the United States...
The morning after the election, a startling picture emerged.
Al Gore is the winner of the national popular vote, but the state of Florida, whomever wins there, wins the White House.
The margin was so narrow, the Miami Herald prepared 3 versions of the morning paper.
The Daily Mail, President Who, it says it's...
Out of more than 6 million ballots cast, Bush was ahead by just over 1,700 votes, less than 3/100ths of a percentage point. Florida law requires a machine recount if the difference is less than 1/2 of 1%. So the Division of Elections ordered all 67 counties to recount.
The supervisors of elections are complying with our request to try to get the recount done by this evening.
The recount that's occurring in Florida is an automatic recount based on state law. It was not requested by the Gore campaign, and we've gone through those before.
But there were, and still are, questions about how complete this mandatory recount really was.
To this day, there has not been a true statewide recount as mandated by state law. A lot of counties just kept their original numbers or just double-checked one machine to make sure one machine didn't work.
Even with this partial recount, George Bush's lead started to shrink.
The initial election night result had Bush ahead of Gore by a little over 1,700 votes. By the time the machine recount was completed, that margin was 350 votes. So it became clear that the numbers were changing to Gore's favor.
Officials from both campaigns immediately flew to Florida.
The stakes are high, and the circumstances demand responsibility by both political parties to ensure that there is not the slightest appearance of a conflict of interest. I have chosen to recuse myself from serving on the Elections Canvassing Commission. Florida law requires that my replacement on the commission be appointed by the director of the Division of Elections in the Department of State.
After the election, Jeb Bush was highly active, hustling in every way to set the stage for the recount because he knew there would be a recount. In the middle of the night, on election night, his legal counsel stepped down as legal counsel for the governor's office and went to work for the Bush campaign, as did a number of other aides in his office, key aides who moved over instantaneously to the Bush campaign. They contacted all of the Bush political apparatus around the entire state of Florida and said, your job, the governor says your job, is to deliver for this campaign.
After the machine recount, officials revealed that thousands of ballots did not register a vote for president at all. With Al Gore trailing by only 357 votes, those unread ballots became crucial.
And I was amazed to hear that there were about 175,000 ballots in the state of Florida that the machines had not read, either undervotes or overvotes. And I thought to myself, and I think a lot of us thought, okay, well, let's find out who won those.
Some of these ballots were rejected because of malfunctioning voting machines. People could not punch all the way through the ballots.
The machines in Palm Beach County had not been cleaned out for 2 years. And there's no way that you can punch through.
Other ballots were rejected because some counties had confusing ballot designs, like the infamous butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County.
I know that Bush is first on the ballot, and I know that Gore will be second, because here's his name second. So I pressed the hole for second. Then, realizing my error, I pressed the hole for Gore.
Looking at the ballot laid out incorrectly, I voted incorrectly. The arrow went to a place between two holes.
We had about 19,100 overvotes. That's what an overvote is, a double punch.
What a lot of people don't know is that many counties in Florida had something called the caterpillar ballot. That was where the names moved like a caterpillar from row to row. At the same time, people are told to vote on every page.
If you voted on every page, your ballot would be void because on 2 pages, we had presidential candidates. On November the 10th, they announced that Duval County was throwing out 27,000 votes. 16,000 of them was in precincts that vote 98% Democratic.
Although the machines could not read these ballots, very often the voter's intention could be determined by manual examination. So the Democrats requested a manual recount of these ballots.
It is wrong, simply wrong, and I would submit not fair to say, as our opponents do over and over, that these votes have never been counted. They've been counted just like all of the other non-votes.
The only 4 counties in which hand counts were requested were counties where there was real anomalies that showed up, real irregularities.
The Gore campaign petitioned 4 counties for manual recounts. They picked counties which had reported numerous irregularities on Election Day, counties which were heavily Democratic: Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Volusia.
What is at stake is the integrity of our democracy, making sure that the will of the American people is expressed and accurately received.
This is ballot 1.
The manual recounts in the 4 counties began, but the Gore campaign never requested a statewide manual recount of all 175,000 unread ballots.
That decision was contrary to just basic recount strategy. The basic rule is if you're behind, you ask to recount everything.
There are other options that we have before us, and we're going to hold on to those options for the present time.
The early decision not to go for an across-the-board recount of everything in a very real way limited the options that would be available at a subsequent date.
More important than whether or not it achieved its political ends is the fact that he was rhetorically saying count every vote, and he was not trying to count every vote.
I mean, we went through this long discussion about whether these ballots, both overvotes and undervotes, should be reviewed or not. But Florida law, I think, dictated that they should be looked at.
Ballot 67 is a vote for Gore.
A canvassing board may not reject a ballot where the intent is clear. To reject a ballot, you must first look at it. You can't just throw it out because it didn't go through the machine. The law is clear. And damaged ballots must be reviewed by the canvassing board, and those that are marked improperly. It's a big task, but the law is clear.
Manual recounts of punch cards have been done literally thousands and thousands of times throughout the history of our country, and they always come out more accurate than the machine count election night.
But the Republicans began to advance the idea that there was something wrong with manual recounts.
The nation has left manual counting in favor of machine counting because it is less subject to human error and potential mischief.
The state of Texas recently enacted a law signed by Governor Bush providing for a hand count as the best way to reach an accurate result in certain disputed situations.
There's been a lot of talk about the Texas manual recount provision. It says a dimple chad can be considered only where it also is accompanied by a clearly ascertainable intent of the voter to vote.
They were completely mocking the idea of hand recounts when, in fact, George Bush, as governor of Texas in 1997, had signed one of the most liberal hand recount laws that exists into law. Basically the same law that they were mocking in Florida.
If you're ahead, you try to prevent any recount from occurring. We're not judging the Republican strategy by what's in the public interest. The Gore strategy has to be judged by the same standard, what was in the best interest of their client.
Brushing aside the manual recounts, George Bush began planning his transition team to the White House. Then the Republicans launched a campaign to discredit the standards used to assess the ballots.
To suggest just bumping it is a vote, just touching it is a vote, is a manifest injustice.
What's going on upstairs is theater. Democrats are sitting very quietly watching this count proceed while the Republicans are doing their best to make sure that we do not get a full count.
We have people bending ballots. We have Chad starting to fall out on the tables over there.
That's absolutely false. It is a very calm process. Nothing like that is happening whatsoever.
So they now argue that a punch card vote should count even if there appears to be only an indentation. This, of course, is the famous dimple Chad.
You can't make a dimple by mistake. You make it because the equipment fails you. And that's pretty clear.
What we had argued was that the voter intent rule that's probably most reflective by, oddly enough, the Texas statute that George Bush signed into law is what should have prevailed in Florida. That says you look at the totality of the ballot.
I mean, any analysis, any examination of those ballots through a completely legitimate method of a recount, which happens all the time in America, any examination of those ballots shows that there are some votes there.
As the recounts continued, the Republicans carried their battle to federal court.
And therefore, this morning, we have asked that the United States District Court for the Southern District of Florida.
They wanted this in federal court. They did not want this in state court. Federal courts are known to be more conservative, and state courts, especially in Florida, are known to be more liberal.
While the courts considered the Republican lawsuit, Secretary of State Harris announced that there would be no extension of the deadline to certify the election.
That deadline is November 17th, 2000.
Katherine Harris was a very smart political operative who had aggressively been trying to position herself to be a player in Florida and national politics.
She had played a very, very active role in the Bush campaign, had gone up to New Hampshire during the New Hampshire primary to campaign for him, which a lot of elections officials in the state were really surprised at because she's the chief elections officer of the state. This is the woman who Florida was counting on for fair and impartial leadership during this recount.
The Democrats asked a Florida court for an extension of the deadline, but were denied. The judge told Harris that she could reject the manual recounts, but would have to have a good reason. Harris promptly asked the counties to justify their manual recounts. County officials replied immediately, and Harris responded.
I've decided it is my duty under Florida law to exercise my discretion in denying these requested amendments.
Palm Beach County was furious.
This board has now been mandated by the chief election officer of the state of Florida not to count the votes of the people of Palm Beach County.
You have a binding opinion from the Division of Elections.
What happens? Do we go to jail? Because I'm willing to go to jail.
No, I just felt that
The Democrats appealed to the Florida Supreme Court.
Hear ye, hear ye! The Supreme Court of the great state of Florida!
The court ordered Harris to delay certification until it could rule on the case. During the delay, the manual recounts continued. Both Democratic and Republican observers sat and watched the counting of each ballot, but the two camps fought over the process.
There's never been a uniform standard from the very beginning that's lasted all the way through when it comes to talking about which of these ballots are going to be counted and which ones are not.
It is obvious that you know that you can't get this election any other way. So what are we going to do, recount all of these votes again? You've told these lawyers to go bring you more votes. And I assume we're going to keep bringing them to you until such time as you've got 1,000 votes. And I think that's what you're looking for.
All right, Mr. Scherer, you're out of line.
Okay?
Okay? And we'll go ahead and recess. I'll ask the deputies to clear the courtroom, and Mr. Scherer is not welcome back in this room. He can watch the proceedings from outside.
They did everything they could to slow it down. There's one point in time I remember that Bill Scherer, the Republican lead counsel, came into the canvassing board and just leveled a bunch of false accusations at the canvassing board about how they were counting the votes, and he served subpoenas on them, and they had to shut down the counting temporarily because the canvassing board members had to run to court to go appear before the judge to talk about whether or not we were eating chads.
As the deadline approached, Republicans turned their attention to another arena, the overseas absentee ballots.
We're thousands of miles here away in Kosovo, and our absentee ballots it could come down to our absentee ballots making the vote. It's really kind of an exciting time for us. It makes the military, all of us here, pretty much feel like we could make the election.
According to Florida law, absentee ballots must be postmarked or signed and dated by Election Day. Democrats sought to disqualify ballots which did not follow these rules.
And what is this one, Chair? APO here. APO. December. It's not even December yet. I know.
A targeted effort by the Democratic Party sought to throw out as many as a third of the overseas absentee ballots received since Election Day. Many of them, the votes of the men and women of our United States Armed Forces who are serving the cause of freedom throughout the world.
The rules that we tried to impart to our people were the rules for everybody, civilians and military. It became the military can vote no matter what. And that was the chant that was picked up by the Republican lawyers subsequently, and that's how they were able, in my view, to browbeat canvassing boards around the state into accepting votes that were illegal as hell.
There were widespread counties that counted ballots that were patently not legal, because they were postmarked after the election, or they were from people who weren't even registered to vote in the county.
A New York Times investigation found 680 illegal absentee ballots included in the official results certified by Katherine Harris.
And only the performance that Bush, the boost he got from the absentee overseas ballots that were certified 10 days later, that's where he got his official margin of 537 votes.
The Democrats lost votes to this Republican strategy, but they received good news on the legal front. The Florida Supreme Court moved the deadline for the hand recount to November 26th. Republicans immediately appealed to the United States Supreme Court and stepped up pressure on the local election boards.
Raucous demonstrations, including by congressional aides that had Republicans who had been flown in from Washington. There became this pounding on the doors and really kind of a Republican mini riot.
In Miami, the demonstration was led by Republican staffers.
The canvassing board, when they did reassemble publicly, just decided to stop counting altogether.
The Broward County recount faced similar pressures.
We will not let a group of paid political operatives from out of state come into Broward County and stop the fair and accurate count that's going on in Broward County.
When the deadline arrived, in Broward County there was a net gain of 563 votes for Al Gore. Volusia County showed a net gain of 96 votes for Gore. Palm Beach County was not able to finish by the deadline. They filed what they had completed and continued counting. But Catherine Harris rejected these returns.
Palm Beach County has submitted a document that purports to be an amended return, but contains two different compilations of the presidential vote.
The Miami-Dade recount had been shut down, so no returns were filed. On November 26th, Catherine Harris made the official announcement.
On behalf of the State Elections Canvassing Commission, and in accordance with the laws of the state of Florida, I hereby declare Governor George W. Bush the winner of Florida's 25 electoral votes for the President of the United States.
The game seemed lost for the Democrats, but they approached the Florida courts to contest the election one last time. Then, a stunning announcement.
By a vote of 4-3, the majority of the court has reversed the decision of the trial court in part. The circuit court shall order a manual recount of all undervotes in any Florida county where such a recount has not yet occurred.
We have no alternative other than to appeal once again to the Supreme Court of the United States for relief. We have already put in motion the process to do that.
That recounting started on the morning of December the 9th at 8 a.m.
3 hours later, the United States Supreme Court granted an emergency stay, stopping the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court.
We look up to the United States Supreme Court as a revered institution like no other. And if we can't rely on them to be above the fray, to be above politics, whom can we rely upon?
A very unusual late-night ruling from the United States Supreme Court. Lawyers, students, and history buffs line up to grab a copy of the ruling that ended it all. The court rules 5-4 that the recount ordered by the Florida Supreme Court is so flawed, there's no way to start it up again and make the decision ending any lingering hope of a recount.
The Supreme Court's a political institution, and we should be clear about that. Politics is inextricably bound up with the interpretation of the law. There's no use in pretending as if most of the time the Supreme Court acts like judges, and in this one case they acted like politicians. No, politics is always part of what they do.
They based their ruling on the allegation that in Florida, because there was a lack of a uniform standard of counting votes, this violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution.
If one applied the standard that the court wanted to use, it would probably invalidate all the elections in the country. You couldn't take them seriously in that. The notion that all voters should have their vote counted equally would, for instance, mean that if different voting machines operate differently, then a state couldn't have different voting machines in different precincts. All states do that.
The United States Supreme Court also ignored long-standing Florida court rulings which permit hand recounts.
The Florida courts had for 75 years had a governing principle that the intent of the voter prevails over technicalities.
Really saying that the votes, the 9,000...
And that's been Florida law 75 years. The Supreme Court simply ignored it. They didn't quote that provision of Florida law. They made believe it didn't exist.
The dissenting U.S. Supreme Court justices, all four of them, said, if you're really serious about the fact that there's an equal protection violation here, and we don't want that, we want a uniform standard, there's a very simple solution. Send the case back to the Florida Supreme Court with instructions to come up with a uniform standard and then continue the vote for 6 more days.
The court majority then ruled that their decision would apply only to the Bush versus Gore case.
The Supreme Court turned a blind eye to the actual disenfranchisement of tens of thousands of voters in Florida and said, we're going to use equal protection to freeze the voting because the pregnant chads might be treated differently in one county than in another. It's got nothing to do with anything that would actually benefit people.
Legal scholars say this is probably the first time in the 210-year history of the United States Supreme Court that the court limited its ruling to the case in front of it. They knew that if that ruling were applied elsewhere, it would invalidate elections throughout the entire country. So what did they do? They said, we'll solve the problem. We'll apply it only to this case right here.
The U.S. Supreme Court has precise rules on when a judge should take himself or herself off a case. Antonin Scalia's two sons both worked for law firms that had represented the Bush campaign in the recount process. After the recount process, one of his sons received a top-level appointment by the Bush administration to be the legal counsel for the Labor Department. It is unreasonable to suggest that Antonin Scalia did not understand those potential advantages. It is equally unreasonable to suggest that Clarence Thomas, whose wife had the role of reviewing resumes for potential Bush appointees, it is unreasonable to suggest that he couldn't have recognized that there was a clear conflict there, that his wife's role would be enhanced, advantaged by a Bush victory.
Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, she said in front of witnesses that she was very, very upset. She said this is terrible when the projections were that Gore would win the election. Her husband explained to the crowd that it was terrible because she wanted to retire and would only retire if a Republican could name her successor.
The four justices who opposed the majority each wrote a dissenting opinion. The most forceful was Justice Stevens, who wrote, "Although we may never know with complete certainty the identity of the winner of this year's presidential election, the identity of the loser is perfectly clear. It is the nation's confidence in the judge as an impartial guardian of the rule of law." In November 2001, a media consortium which included the Washington Post, Orlando Sentinel, New York Times, and Los Angeles Times released the results of a thorough analysis of Florida's unread ballots.
Based on what is marked on the ballots, if you look at every ballot, it would indicate that more people voted for Gore.
We found anywhere from 2,000 to 25,000 ballots out of these 175,000 ballots were, in fact, legal votes.
The reason why there's a lot of retrievable overvotes is this pattern, particularly on optical ballots, where people vote the candidate and then they go to the bottom of the ballot, and at the bottom, after the candidates, it says write in candidate name. Well, a lot of people followed that instruction. They wrote it in again.
The state law that was in play during the election specifically says you have to count such ballots as votes.
It is only when the state's undervotes were counted that George Bush would have retained his lead.
Well, how can some counties be counted and others not counted without discrimination?
I don't think that they can, but there are some counties where the supervisors have interpreted the statutes to not require a machine recount in that automatic machine recount.
The people who commit a kind of voter fraud regularly in American elections are the people who run those elections. And they do have an incentive because American elections are not run by nonpartisan officials. American elections are run by the parties. It's a way of fixing elections by trying to make it less likely that some people vote than other people vote.
I think he himself, his own instincts, from what I've read subsequently, were that he should go for a statewide hand count, but he was talked out of it by some of his advisors.
After the election, their job was to make sure that the votes were counted. All the votes, not just their own. They got so concerned about finding the 500 votes that they needed that they forgot their broader responsibility.
So in the end, they settled on these 4 Democratic-leaning counties. And instead of getting or asking for a statewide recount of all 175,000 ballots that were unread, they focused on these 4. And I think that was a mistake. I think that was a serious mistake.
But the Gore camp would have won. They would have pulled this thing off had they been good citizens. Had they actually gone out and said, we really do want every vote counted and we want to make sure that everybody's treated fairly.
It's a hard task for an African-American person to really go out and vote because we're not sure whether this person is really for us or against us.
Friends, people think that this election coming up that is going to be all right. It's not going to be all right. They have plans for us. They have the money and they have the plan.
Because if you take these same people back to the poll again and this happen again, you know what's going to happen at the next election? No one is going to show up.
That's what they want you to do. They want you to get disgusted. That's the problem you're playing. Okay, you don't want to. We got to keep on fighting. You have to keep on. You can't give up.
Always remember that one person can make a difference in this world, but then you've got to get out and organize.
The idea is to build a new generation of young people who are thinking about voting rights, about electoral reform, and about the weaknesses in democracy and how they tie to the issues that they care about.
We recognize that this strange and sometimes twisted democracy that we have is our democracy nonetheless. It is what we make it. And so as stewards of that democracy, I think we have a very special responsibility to make sure that we improve upon it and that we leave a democracy and a democratic form of government and, quite frankly, a republic to the next generation that they can be proud of and recognize that it is one that has survived the test of time, and it will survive this, and it will get better because of this.